Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to a long, quiet journey through the grimy, unglamorous world of medieval peasant hygiene in Europe. If you're tucked into bed, ready to drift off, this slow tale of dirt, rags, and survival might just lull you into sleep. Picture a world where soap was a rumor, water was a chore, and staying clean was less about comfort and more about avoiding shame. Tonight, we'll wander through the muddy villages, cramped huts, and smoky hearths of the Middle Ages, where peasants' men, women, and children scraped by with the barest tools to keep themselves presentable. No hot showers, no fluffy towels. Just cold water, rough cloth, and endless effort. So, settle in, dim the lights, maybe crack a window for that soft nighttime breeze, and let's begin. If you enjoy this kind of history, give a quiet nod to yourself. No need to like or subscribe. Just rest. This is boring history made for sleep. Imagine a peasant's home in medieval Europe, sometime between the 10th and 15th centuries. A single room, maybe two if the family was lucky. The walls are wattle and daub sticks, woven together and smeared with mud, straw, and animal dung. The floor is packed earth, uneven, sometimes damp from rain seeping through the thatched roof. A fire burns in the center, its smoke curling up to a hole in the ceiling, if there is one. The air smells of wood smoke, sweat, and yesterday's stew. This is where life happens, cooking, eating, sleeping, and, yes, cleaning. But cleaning wasn't what we think of today. There were no sinks, no faucets, no tiled bathrooms with mirrors and soft lighting. Hygiene was a battle fought with buckets, rags, and whatever water could be carried from a well or stream. Every act of staying clean was manual, slow, and shared. Among the household, privacy. That was a dream for the rich. For peasants, it was a corner of the room, a turned back, or a moment when the children were outside. Let's start with the basics. Water. Water was the foundation of any hygiene routine, but getting it was no small task. Most villages had a communal well, a stream, or a river nearby, but nearby could mean a half-mile walk. Women, and sometimes children, were the ones who fetched it, carrying heavy wooden buckets or clay jugs. These buckets weren't light wooden ones, could weigh several pounds empty, and water added another 20 or 30 pounds. The path to the water source was often muddy, rutted from cartwheels, or frozen in winter. A woman might slip, spill half the bucket, and have to start over. If the well was dry or the stream too muddy, she'd have to wait or walk farther. Once home, the water wasn't always clean. It might carry silt, leaves, or worse, animal waste or human refuse from upstream. Boiling it was an option, but that required firewood, which was scarce for the poorest families. Firewood meant gathering twigs, chopping logs, or scavenging. Scraps from the forest, and every piece was precious. Saved for cooking or warmth rather than heating water for washing. So what did they do with this hard-won water? Not much, by our standards. Bathing, as we know it, was rare. A full-body bath might happen once a month, maybe less, especially in winter. The effort was enormous. First, you needed a tub, usually a shallow wooden barrel or a hollowed-out log. Nothing like the deep porcelain tubs of today. Filling it meant multiple trips to the well, heating water over the fire, and pouring it in bucket by bucket. The whole family might share the same water, one after another, until it was murky and cold. Men went first, then older boys, then children, and finally women. By the time a woman got her turn, the water was more sludge than bath. Imagine sinking into that, knowing it's your only chance to feel clean for weeks. Most didn't bother. Instead, they relied on wiping down their bodies with a damp cloth. Focusing on the face, hands, feet, underarms, places where sweat and dirt were most noticeable. These cloths were nothing special. No soft cotton towels, no microfiber. They were scraps of linen or wool, often cut from old clothing or worn-out bedding. Linen was preferred because it absorbed water better, but it wasn't cheap. A single linen shift might take days to weave by hand, and most families couldn't afford to waste fabric on washcloths. So they reused what they had until it frayed into threads. The cloth was dipped into a basin of water, maybe warmed, maybe not tanned, scrubbed against the skin. No soap, unless you were unusually wealthy. Soap, when it existed, was a crude mix of animal fat and wood ash, called lye soap. It was harsh, sometimes burning the skin, and most peasants couldn't afford it anyway. Instead, they used alternatives: a handful of ashes from the fire, a splash of vinegar or water infused with herbs like rosemary or lavender. These weren't chosen for luxury. They were just what grew nearby or sat in the kitchen. The routine was practical but far from thorough. A woman might stand in the corner of the hut, behind a hanging blanket if she was lucky, and wipe her face first. Then her neck, her underarms, her hands. If she had time, maybe her feet. The rest of the body was often ignored, not out of laziness, but because water was scarce and time was scarcer. A peasant's day was filled with work: tending crops, milking cows, spinning wool, baking bread, mending clothes. Hygiene was squeezed into the cracks of the day: early morning before the fire was lit, or late evening when the family slept. Children watched and learned, handed a rag to wipe their own faces, taught to focus on what showed: hands, face, maybe. The neck. Cleanliness wasn't about feeling fresh. It was about looking respectable enough to avoid gossip at the market or church. Let's talk about the smell. Medieval peasants didn't have deodorant, and body odor was a fact of life. Everyone smelled of sweat, smoke, animals, or the fields they worked in. But there was a difference between expected odor and offensive odor. A woman who smelled too strongly might be whispered about, called slovenly, or worse. So they tried to manage it. Herbs were their main weapon. Lavender, mint, sage, or thyme were dried and crushed, then tucked into clothing or rubbed onto the skin. A woman might keep a small pouch of herbs tied to her belt or sewn into her shift-a-loose. Long undergarment worn closest to the skin. These pouches released a faint scent when she moved, masking the sweat that built up under heavy wool dresses. Some rubbed herb-infused water under their arms or behind their ears before heading to church. It wasn't perfume, it was survival. The goal was to blend in, not to stand out. Clothing itself was a hygiene tool. The shift, that simple linen undergarment, was the first line of defense. It absorbed sweat and body oils, protecting the outer dress, which was rarely washed. Outer garments, wool dresses, aprons, or cloaks were too heavy and valuable to clean often. Washing them meant hauling more water, scrubbing by hand, and waiting days for them to dry, often in damp, smoky huts where mold was a risk. Instead, dresses were brushed off, aired out, or beaten with a stick to knock out dirt. The shift, though, could be rinsed more often, maybe once a week if water was plentiful. It was hung to dry near the fire, sometimes still damp when worn again. In winter, drying was a nightmare. Clothes froze stiff or stayed wet for days. So many peasants wore slightly damp shifts, risking chills or rashes. Hair was another challenge. Washing it was rare, maybe once every few weeks. Wet hair in a cold, drafty hut could mean illness or at least discomfort. Instead, peasants brushed their hair daily with wooden combs, scraping out dirt and lice. Lice were common, not a sign of filth but a fact of crowded living. A mother might sit by the fire, combing her children's hair, picking out bugs with her fingers or a needle. Women with long hair braided it tightly or covered it with a cap or scarf to keep it clean longer. These caps weren't just for modesty. They blocked dust, smoke, and insects. Some used vinegar or herbal rinses, rosemary water, perhaps to cut through grease. But even that was a luxury. Most relied on brushing and covering, accepting that hair would smell of smoke or sweat by the end of the week. Teeth got even less attention. No toothbrushes, no toothpaste. Peasants chewed on twigs, willow or hazel, frayed at the end to form a crude brush, or rubbed their teeth with a cloth dipped in salt or ashes. Salt was abrasive, scraping off food, but it stung the gums. Ashes were worse, gritty and harsh. But they were free. Some chewed sage leaves for their slight antibacterial effect and sharp taste. Bad breath was common, especially among those who ate coarse bread and onions, the peasant staples. Tooth decay wasn't as rampant as you'd think. Diets were low in sugar, but gum disease was a problem. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, and pain were part of aging. If a tooth went bad, it was pulled by a family member or a village healer. No anesthesia, just a quick yank and a prayer. Public spaces offered no relief. Villages had no public bathrooms, no running water. If you needed to relieve yourself, you found a ditch, a field, or a chamber pot indoors. Chamber pots were simple: clay or wooden vessels emptied into a pit or stream. In summer, the smell was unbearable. In winter, the contents froze. Women managed their bodily functions discreetly, squatting behind a bush or waiting until dark. Men had less to hide, but for women, modesty was everything. A stained dress or a public mishap could mean months of gossip. During menstruation, women used folded rags, old linen, or wool tucked into their undergarments. These were washed and reused, boiled if possible, but often just rinsed in cold water and hidden to dry. No one talked about it. Girls learned from watching their mothers, not from lessons. Winter made everything harder. Water froze in buckets. Firewood was rationed for cooking, not heating water. Bathing stopped almost entirely. Peasants wrapped themselves in layer shifts, dresses, cloaks, and hoped the smell stayed trapped. Hands and faces were wiped with snow if nothing else was available. Skin cracked from cold and ash, nails split, and hands bled from hauling frozen buckets. Summer wasn't much better. Heat meant more sweat, more odor, and more insects. Flies buzzed around unwashed bodies and chamber pots. Women carried herbs or scented cloths to markets, hoping to mask the smell of a long day's work. Children were part of this cycle. From a young age, they helped fetch water, rinse cloths, or comb hair. A girl might hold a basin for her mother, learning the rhythm of wiping and folding. Boys carried buckets or dumped chamber pots. Hygiene wasn't a choice. It was a chore, like feeding the pigs or mending a fence. No one expected to feel clean. They just wanted to avoid being noticed for the wrong reasons. A woman with a tidy cap, clean hands, and no overpowering smell was considered respectable, even if her shift hadn't been washed in weeks. The church played a role too. Cleanliness was tied to godliness, but not in the way we think. Bathing too often was suspicious. Some priests warned it opened the body to sin or illness. Yet, appearing unkempt at church could draw judgment. Women balanced this by focusing on visible hygiene: a clean face, neat hair, a fresh shift if possible. Before major holidays like Easter or Christmas, they might risk a full bath, heating water for the occasion. It was less about comfort and more about ritual, a way to mark the day as sacred. This was the rhythm of peasant life. Every act of hygiene was a calculation: water, time, firewood, privacy. Nothing was easy, nothing was automatic. A bucket of water carried from the stream might clean a face, rinse a cloth, or soak a baby's swaddling. Every drop was used twice if possible. Waste was unthinkable. And yet, despite the effort, the dirt never fully left. It clung to skin, hair, clothes, and homes. Peasants didn't chase cleanliness. They chased survival. A clean face was a small victory, a way to feel human in a world that offered little mercy. we're stepping deeper into the private corners of peasant life. Now into the unspoken, the hidden, the things no one bragged about at the market. Toileting, menstruation, intimate care. These were realities shaped by scarcity, modesty, and survival. No modern conveniences, no private bathrooms, just practical solutions born of necessity. Settle in, let your mind drift, and let's continue. If you're enjoying this, give a sleepy nod to yourself, no need to do anything else. This is boring history, made for sleep. Let's start with the most basic need, relieving oneself. In a medieval village, there were no toilets as we know them. No porcelain thrones, no flushing pipes. For most peasants, the solution was simple but crude. Outdoors, you found a ditch, a patch of woods, or the edge of a field. Privacy was a luxury, so you moved quickly, especially women who faced harsher judgment for being seen. A woman might wait for dusk or slip behind a hedge, always aware of prying eyes. In the fields, men and women alike squatted where they could, often during a break from harvesting or sowing. The ground absorbed what it could. The rest was left for rain or animals to deal with. It wasn't glamorous, but it was practical. In larger villages, some had a communal latrina pit dug near the edge of town, maybe lined with stones if the village was prosperous. These pits were shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds, and the smell was a constant companion, especially in summer when flies swarmed. Indoors, things weren't much better. Most peasant homes had a chamber, pat of clay, or wooden vessel, sometimes just a cracked bowl or a bucket. It sat in a corner of the single-room hut, used by the whole family. At night, when it was too cold or dangerous to go outside, everyone took turns. The pot was emptied daily, if possible, into a nearby pit, stream, or manure heap. Tempting. It wasn't always straightforward. In winter, the contents could freeze, making the pot harder to clean. In summer, the stench filled the hut, mingling with the smoke from the hearth. Women, often tasked with cleaning, would rinse the pot with water from the well, but water was precious, so they used as little as possible. Sometimes they just scraped it out with a stick or a shard of broken pottery. Hygiene wasn't the goal. Function was, for women, menstruation added another layer of difficulty. There were no disposable pads, no tampons, no over-the-counter pain relief. Instead, women used rags, old scraps of linen or wool, folded and tucked into their undergarments. These weren't purpose-made. They were cut from worn-out shifts or skirts, whatever could be spared. A woman might fold a rag into a thick pad, secure it with a belt or cord, and hope it held through a day of work, spinning, milking, or hauling firewood. Changing it meant finding a moment alone, which was rare. In a crowded hut or busy field, the used rags were rinsed in cold water, maybe boiled if the family could spare the firewood, and hung to dry discreetly, often inside to avoid curious eyes. Bloodstains were stubborn, and clean water wasn't always enough, so women scrubbed with ashes or sand, their hands raw from the effort. The rags were reused month after month, fraying over time until they were too thin to be useful. Disposal wasn't discussed openly. Girls learned from their mothers or older sisters, watching silently as rags were washed and dried. No one explained it, it was just done. Some women buried soiled rags in the garden or near the manure pile where they'd decompose. Others burned them in the hearth, but that risked drawing attention if the fire smoked too much. In poorer households, where fabric was scarce, a woman might use moss or leaves as a last resort, gathered from the forest and tucked into place. These were less absorbent, messier, and harder to manage, but they were free. Pain was another hurdle. Cramps, bloating, or headaches were endured without complaint. There was no time to rest. A woman might chew willow bark, which had a mild, pain-relieving effect, or drink a tea of chamomile or yarrow if she knew the recipe. These remedies were passed down, not written. and varied by village. Intimate care was even more private, rarely mentioned even among family. Washing the genital area was done with the same damp cloth used for the face or hands, often in the same basin of water. Women crouched over a bucket or stood in a corner, moving quickly to avoid being seen. Men had less to hide, but even they sought a moment of solitude. The goal wasn't cleanliness, but preventing discomfort, rashes, infections, or smells that could draw gossip. Water alone wasn't enough, so some used herbal infusions, like thyme or mint, boiled and cooled if they had the means. These weren't common, though. Most made do with a quick rinse or nothing at all. Infections were a risk, especially for women, but medical knowledge was limited. A healer might suggest a poultice of herbs or a prayer, but most ailments were endured until they passed or worsened. Children were part of this too. Young girls were taught early to manage their needs discreetly. A mother might show her daughter how to fold a rag or where to rinse it without being seen. Boys learned to step outside or use the pot without fuss. Chamber pots were often shared, so there was no room for squeamishness. By age 5 or 6, children were helping with chores, including emptying pots or fetching water for washing. It wasn't a choice, it was survival. A family worked together, and hygiene tasks were just another part of the grind, less urgent than planting crops or feeding livestock. But necessary to avoid shame. The lack of privacy shaped everything. In a one-room hut, there was no hiding. A woman might turn her back or wait until others were asleep, but eyes were always near. Blankets or sacks might be hung as makeshift curtains, but they offered little real seclusion. In larger households, with grandparents, children, or in-laws sharing the space, every act was a negotiation. Women bore the brunt of this. A man could step outside to relieve himself with little comment, but a woman doing the same risked her reputation. Gossip was a weapon in small villages, and a woman labeled as unclean or immodest faced whispers that could linger for years. The seasons changed the routine. In summer, streams were more accessible, but they were also dirtier, used by animals and other villagers. In winter, snow might be melted for water, but the cold made washing painful. Hands cracked, skin split, and joints ached from crouching over icy buckets. Women wrapped their hands in rags to protect them, but the rags themselves were often damp or dirty. Parasites were another issue. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived in warm, crowded huts. Scratching was constant, and bites left red welts that could fester. Combing hair or shaking out bedding helped, but only so much. Some smeared their skin with grease or animal fat to repel bugs. But this added to the smell and grime. The church had its say too. Bodily functions were tied to sin, and too much focus on the body could be seen as vanity or worse. Yet, neglecting hygiene entirely was frowned upon, especially for women who were expected to appear modest and tidy at church. Before a major sermon or festival, a woman might scrub her hands and face extra hard, maybe rinse her shift to look presentable. Men faced less scrutiny, but even they combed their hair or wiped their boots to avoid standing out. We're stepping inside the peasant's home now, not just to wash bodies, but to fight the endless battle against dirt, vermin, and decay. These homes, with their earthen floors and leaky roofs, were as much a part of the hygiene struggle as the people living in them. No modern cleaning products, no vacuums, just brooms, ashes, and sheer persistence. Settle deeper into your blankets, let your thoughts soften, and let's continue. If this soothes you, give a sleepy sign o' need to do more. This is boring history, made for sleep. A peasant's home was a single room, maybe two for a larger family, built from whatever the land offered. Walls of wattle and daub-woven sticks plastered with mud and straw kept out the wind, but not always the rain. The roof was thatched, bundles of straw or reeds tied tightly, but gaps let in water during storms. The floor was packed dirt, sometimes covered with rushes or straw to soak up spills and mud. This was the stage for daily life: cooking, sleeping, eating, and cleaning. But keeping it clean was a Sisyphean task. Dirt was everywhere, tracked in from fields, blown in through cracks, or carried by livestock that sometimes shared the space. Chickens, pigs, or goats might wander in, leaving droppings or feathers. The fire in the center of the room added soot and ashes, coating everything in a fine black dust. Smoke stung the eyes and clung to clothes, hair, and skin, a constant reminder of the hearth's warmth and its mess. Sweeping was the first offense. Brooms were handmade, just bundles of twigs or straw tied to a stick. Women, and sometimes children, swept daily, pushing dirt, crumbs, and animal hair toward the door or into the fire. The rushes on the floor were both a help and a hindrance. They absorbed spills grease from cooking, ale from a clumsy hand, or, worse but, they also trapped dirt and bugs. Fresh rushes were laid down every few weeks, if the family could gather them. Cutting rushes meant a trip to a marsh or riverbank, another task in a day already packed with labor. Old rushes were burned or added to the manure pile, but they were never truly clean. Fleas, lice, and tiny beetles lived in them, thriving in the warm, damp straw. A quick sweep didn't get rid of them, it just stirred them up. Vermin were a constant enemy. Rats and mice scurried through the shadows, drawn by scraps of bread or barley. They gnawed on stored grain, climbed into bedding, and left droppings everywhere. Cats were kept not as pets but as hunters, though even a good mouser couldn't catch every rat. Traps were maybe a flat stone propped up with a stick, baited with a crust of bread, but rats were clever and hunger made them bold. Bedbugs were worse. They hid in straw mattresses or wooden bed frames, biting at night and leaving itchy welts. A woman might shake out the bedding daily, beating it with a stick or airing it in the sun, but the bugs always came back, some sprinkled dried herbs, mint or lavender, to the straw to repel them, but it was a weak defense. Fleas jumped from person to person, animal to animal, impossible to escape in a crowded hut. Cleaning the walls or roof was nearly impossible. Mud walls crumbled if scrubbed too hard, and thatch was too high to reach without a ladder, which few owned. Instead, peasants patched leaks with fresh mud or straw, a task often left to men or older boys. If the walls grew moldy from damp, they might scrape it off with a knife or smear on a new layer of daub. The hearth was the heart of the home, but also its dirtiest part. Ashes piled up daily, spilling onto the floor. A woman might sweep them into a pile, scoop them into a bucket, or toss them outside, but some always stayed, ground into the dirt. Ashes weren't wasted. They were used for washing clothes or dishes, mixed with water to form a crude cleaner. It was gritty, harsh on the hands, but it cut through grease better than water alone. Dishes and cooking pots were another challenge. Most peasants owned a few clay pots, maybe a wooden bowl or two, and a single iron cauldron if they were lucky. These were washed with water and ashes, scrubbed with a rag or a handful of straw. Sand was used for tougher stains, scraped against the clay until the pot was usable again. Water was heated sparingly. Firewood was too precious, so washing was often done cold, leaving a film of grease behind. Spoons and knives were wiped clean, rarely soaked. Food scraps weren't scrubbed away. They were eaten by the family, fed to animals, or tossed into the fire. Nothing was thrown out if it could be reused. Even broken pots were kept used as storage or patched with clay. Clothing stored in the hut hung on pegs or stuffed into a corner needed attention, too. Wool dresses and tunics were brushed or beaten to remove dirt, but washing them was a rare event. A woman might rinse her linen shift weekly, but outer garments went months without a proper wash. When they were cleaned, it was a group effort. Women gathered at a stream or well, pounding clothes against rocks or wooden boards, using ashes or lye soap if they had it. The water turned gray with dirt, and hands turned red from cold. Drying was another hurdle. Clothes hung on bushes or near the fire could take days to dry, especially in winter. Mold was a constant threat, leaving white patches or a musty smell that never fully faded. Children were roped into these tasks early. A girl as young as 6 might sweep the floor or shake out bedding, mimicking her mother. Boys carried ashes or fetched rushes, learning to handle the heavy buckets without spilling. It wasn't play. It was work as essential as feeding the chickens or weeding the garden. Everyone contributed because the home was a shared space, and its condition reflected the family's standing. A hut that smelled too strongly of refuse or looked too chaotic could spark gossip. Neighbors noticed everything whose floor was unswept, whose bedding was flea-ridden. Women, especially, bore the weight of this judgment. A tidy home, even if far from clean by modern standards, was a point of pride. The seasons shaped the struggle. In summer, open doors let in dust and flies, but also air to dry, damp corners. In winter, the hut was sealed tight, trapping smoke, sweat, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Rain leaked through the roof, turning the floor to mud. Straw bedding grew damp, breeding mold and bugs. Women stuffed rags into cracks to stop drafts, but it was never enough. Spring brought a chance to air out the hut, shake out bedding, and sweep away winter's grime. But it also meant more work in the fields, leaving less time for cleaning. Autumn was a race to store food and fuel before the cold, with little energy left for scrubbing pots or walls. The church had its influence here too. A clean home was a sign of a virtuous family, though the bar was low. Priests might scold a woman for a filthy hearth, tying it to sloth or sin. Before major festivals, families made an effort sweeping the floor, airing clothes, maybe scattering fresh rushes to appear respectable. It wasn't about comfort. It was about avoiding shame in a village where everyone knew your business. This was the endless cycle. Sweep, shake, scrub, patch. A woman sweeping ashes at dawn. A child beating a blanket. A man patching a wall with mud. The home was never clean, just less dirty. A fragile defense against the chaos of the world outside. Every task was small, repetitive, and vital. Done with tools that barely worked and resources that never lasted. Let's pause here. By the smoky hearth, where a woman sweeps the last of the ashes into a pile, her hands dusted gray. Next, we'll explore how peasants cared for their animals whose dirt and smells were as much a part of the home as the family's own. For now, let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the hum of history fade, and let sleep take over. Picture a village at twilight, the air thick with the scent of hay, manure, and smoke from dying fires. We're turning now to the animals: pigs, chickens, cows, and goats that shared the peasants' world. Their mess blending with the family's own. Keeping them fed, housed, and somewhat clean was as much a part of hygiene as washing a face or sweeping a floor. No disinfectants, no barns with concrete floors, just straw, mud, and endless chores. Settle deeper, breathe slowly, and let's continue. If this calms you, let your mind drift, no need to stir. This is boring history, made for sleep. Animals were the backbone of a peasant's life. A cow gave milk, a pig gave meat, chickens gave eggs, and goats gave both. But they also brought dirt, noise, and smells into the home, often literally. In many villages, animals lived close, sometimes inside the hut during winter, to keep them safe from wolves or thieves. A single-room home might have a corner for a cow or a few chickens, their straw bedding mingling with the family's rushes. The smell was inescapable: wet fur, manure, and sour milk, layered over the ever-present wood smoke. Keeping animals and their messes under control was a daily task, shared by men, women, and children, each with their role in the endless cycle of care. Start with the pigs. Most families had one or two, prized for their ability to eat scraps and turn them into meat. Pigs roamed the village or nearby woods, rooting for acorns or garbage. But they were brought home at night to a pen or a corner of the hut. Their pens were simple wooden stakes driven into the ground, lined with straw or mud. Cleaning them meant shoveling out manure, a job often left to men or older boys. The manure was valuable, piled into heaps for fertilizing fields, but moving. It was heavy work. A wooden shovel or pitchfork, worn smooth from use, scooped the muck into a cart or a pile outside. Straw was replaced when it could be spared, but fresh straw was costly, so the pen often stayed damp and foul. Pigs tracked mud into the hut, their bristles shedding dirt or fleas. A woman might sweep around the pen, cursing the extra mess, but there was no stopping it. Chickens were just as messy. They scratched in the yard or inside the hut, scattering feathers and droppings. Their coops, if they had them, were crude wooden slats or woven branches, stuffed with straw that quickly turned soggy. Women and children gathered eggs daily, brushing away filth or wiping the eggs with a damp rag. Cleaning the coop was a weekly chore, scraping out droppings and replacing straw, but it was never thorough. Feathers stuck to everything, floating into cooking pots or bedding. Chickens also drew rats, which meant more traps or cats to manage. A child might be sent to scatter ashes around the coop to deter pests, but it only worked so well. The constant clucking and scratching added to the chaos, a reminder that animals were both a blessing and a burden. Cows and goats were kept outside when possible, in a small yard or tethered near the hut. Their stalls, if they existed, were mud-floored, lined with straw or old rushes. Milking was a woman's job, done twice a day, squatting on a low stool with a wooden bucket. Milk splashed, hands grew sticky, and flies buzzed around the animals. Tail, cleaning the udder before milking was rare, maybe a quick wipe with a rag if the cow was visibly muddy. The milk often had bits of dirt or hair strained through a cloth if the family was careful. After milking, the stall needed attention. Manure was shoveled out, straw raked over, but the smell lingered. In winter, when animals were brought inside, the hut became a barn. The cow's breath warmed the air, but its droppings and sour milk made every surface dirtier. Grooming animals was minimal. A cow might be brushed with a bundle of straw to knock off mud before milking, but it was more about keeping the milk clean than caring for the animal. Horses, if a family had one, were brushed by men or boys using a wooden comb or their hands to scrape off dirt. Goats and pigs got almost no grooming. They were too tough, too wild. Fleas and ticks were a problem for all animals, jumping onto humans or bedding. Some peasants rubbed animals with grease or herbal pastes, mint or garlic too. Repel bugs, but it was a half-hearted effort. Slaughtering an animal, usually in autumn, was its own mess. Blood, guts, and hides were processed in the yard or hut, leaving stains and smells for days. Women scraped hides with knives. Men hauled offal to the manure pile, and children watched. Learning the grim routine. Water was as crucial for animals as for humans, but just as hard to get. A family might share their well water with their livestock, carrying extra buckets to a trough or pen. Streams were used when possible, but animals muddied the water, making it less fit for human use. In dry seasons, water was rationed, and animals drank from puddles or ditches, bringing more dirt back to the hut. Feeding them added to the mess. Hay or grain was stored in the hut or a lean-to, attracting mice and mold. Spilled feed mixed with mud, creating a slurry that clung to shoes and skirts. Women swept it up, children carried fresh hay, and the cycle started again. Children learned early to help. A boy might lead a cow to water, a girl scatter straw in the chicken coop. By age 7, they were part of the system, hauling buckets or shoveling manure. It wasn't optional. Animals were survival, their milk and meat as vital as the crops in the field. But their mess made hygiene harder. A woman sweeping the floor might curse the chicken feathers or pig tracks, but she'd sweep anyway, knowing it was endless. Men patched pens or carried water, their hands rough from the work. Everyone smelled of animals' manure, milk, or wet fur blending with the human sweat and smoke. The seasons dictated the rhythm. In summer, animals stayed outside, their mess spread across the yard. Flies were relentless, drawn to manure and spilled feed. In winter, animals crowded into the hut, their warmth a comfort, but their filth a nightmare. Straw bedding rotted faster in the damp, and cleaning was harder with frozen buckets and limited light. Spring meant calving or kidding, more mess from births and afterbirth. Autumn brought slaughter, the yard slick with blood and scraps. Every season added to the labor, the dirt, the smell. The church had little to say about animals, except to bless them on certain feast days or warn against waste. A family that lost a cow to neglect might face whispers of laziness, but most understood the struggle. A clean pen or a tidy yard wasn't the goal. Keeping animals alive was. A woman raking straw, a man shoveling manure, a child chasing chickens. These were the small, endless acts that kept the household running. Let's pause here. In the dim yard, where a woman scatters straw in a muddy pen, her hands cold and gritty. Next, we'll explore how peasants dealt with illness and injury wounds, fevers, and infections with no doctors or pharmacies, just herbs and hope. For now, let the world blur, let the drone of history fade, and let sleep settle in. We're stepping now into the world of illness and injury where wounds festered. Fevers burned, and healing was a mix of hope, herbs, and whispered prayers. No doctors, no hospitals, just the knowledge passed down through generations, scratched out with whatever grew nearby or sat in the kitchen. This is a longer tale, so settle deeper into your pillows. Let your breaths slow. And let's wander through the slow, messy struggle to stay alive. If this soothes you, give a gentle nod to yourself. No need to move. No need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. In a medieval village, illness was as common as dirt. The body was fragile, worn down by labor, hunger, and the constant grind of survival. A cut from a scythe, a burn from the hearth, a fever from bad water, these were ordinary threats. Peasants didn't have pharmacies or surgeons. They had each other, their hands, and the plants growing in the fields or forests. Healing was a household task, often led by women. Who were the keepers of remedies? The ones who stirred pots of herb-soaked water or wrapped wounds in rags. Men helped, too, especially with injuries from the fields or tools. And children watched, learning the quiet art of mending a broken body. Every cure was a gamble. Every illness a test of endurance. Start with wounds, cuts, scrapes, or burns. These were daily risks. A man might slice his hand while chopping wood, the axe slipping on a wet log. A woman could burn her arm stirring a pot over the fire, the flames licking too high. Children, running barefoot, stepped on thorns or sharp stones. A wound wasn't just painful, it was dangerous. Without clean water or antiseptics, infection was a constant threat. The first step was to clean the wound, but clean water was hard to come by. A woman might fetch a bucket from the well, maybe boiling it if firewood allowed, though often it was used cold, silt, and all. She'd pour it over the cut, letting it sting, or soak a rag to wipe away blood and dirt. The rag was rarely clean, maybe. The same one used for washing dishes or faces, but it was all they had. After cleaning, the wound needed protection. Bandages were strips of linen, torn from old shifts or scraps of cloth. These weren't sterile. They were just the least dirty rags available, maybe rinsed and dried by the fire. A woman would wrap the wound tightly, tying it with a cord or another strip of fabric. If the cut was deep, she might pack it with moss or cobwebs, gathered from corners of the hut or barn. They were thought to stop bleeding, and sometimes they did, though no one knew why. Herbs were the next defense. Plantain leaves, crushed into a paste, were pressed onto cuts for their soothing effect. Yarrow, chewed or pounded, was stuffed into wounds to slow blood flow. These plants grew wild near villages, and women knew where to find them, picking handfuls. While fetching water or gathering firewood, infections were the real danger. A cut that turned red, hot, or swollen could mean death. Peasants watched wounds closely, sniffing for the sour smell of pus. If infection set in, remedies grew desperate. A woman might boil garlic or onions, mashing them into a poultice to draw out the poison. The smell was sharp, clinging to the hut, but it was better than losing a limb or life. Honey was another cure, if the family had it. A beehive was a treasure, and honey was smeared on wounds to fight infection, its sticky sweetness sealing the cut from air. But honey was rare, a luxury for most, so they relied on cheaper options. Vinegar splashed on to burn away infection, or a paste of ashes and fat, gritty and unpleasant, but always available. Burns were trickier. A woman scalded by hot stew or a child singed by a spark had no ice to cool the skin. Instead, they used cold water, if they could spare it, or snow. In winter, after cooling, the burn was coated with grease pig fat or goose drippings to keep it soft and prevent cracking. Some used egg whites, whipped and smeared on, believing it eased the pain. Others turned to herbs again, comfrey leaves, bruised and laid over the burn, or aloe if it grew nearby. These remedies weren't scientific. There were trial and error, passed down by mothers and grandmothers. Some worked, some didn't, but all were done with care, a quiet hope that the body would mend. Fevers were even harder to fight. A child shivering by the fire, a man sweating through his tunic, these were signs of trouble. Fevers came from bad water, spoiled food, or just the damp, cold air of a poorly sealed hut. The first response was rest, if the family could afford it. A sick person might lie on a straw mattress near the fire, wrapped in every blanket available. But rest was rare. Work didn't stop, and a missing pair of hands meant less food or fuel. Women brewed teas to break the fever. Willow bark, bitter and chewed raw or steeped in hot water, eased pain and heat. Elderflower or chamomile, dried from summer, was boiled into a weak tea, sipped slowly to calm the body. These herbs were gathered in warmer months, stored in sacks, or hung from the rafters, their scent mingling with the hut's smoke and damp. If the fever wouldn't break, more drastic measures were tried. A woman might wrap the sick person's feet in cloths soaked with vinegar or mustard paste, believing it would draw the heat downward. Some families bled the sick, cutting a small vein with a knife and letting blood drip into a bowl. Last resort, done by a village healer or an elder, and it often weakened the patient more. Prayers were just as common, whispered pleas to saints or the Virgin Mary, sometimes with a charm like a dried herb or a scrap of cloth touched to a holy relic. The Church approved of prayers but frowned on charms, calling them superstition. Yet peasants used both, hedging their bets. Toothaches and mouth sores were another plague. Without dentists, a bad tooth could torment for years. Peasants chewed cloves, if they could get them, or sage leaves to dull the pain. A woman might rub salt into her gums, wincing at the sting, to clean sores or ease swelling. Abscesses were lanced with a needle or knife, a grim task done by whoever had the steadiest hand. If a tooth rotted beyond saving, it was pulled, yanked out with pliers or a string tied to a door. No numbing, just a quick tug and a scream. Children learned to endure it, watching their parents grit their teeth through the same. Skin ailments, strashes, boils, or sores were common, especially in winter when damp clothes and crowded huts bred irritation. Boils were lanced and drained, then packed with herbs or ash paste. Rashes were rubbed with fat or herbal water, like nettle or mint, to stop the itching. Lice and fleas, ever present, caused their own sores from scratching. A woman might comb her children's hair nightly, crushing lice between her nails, or rub grease into their scalps to suffocate the bugs. It was messy, smelly work, done by firelight with tired hands. Children were part of healing, too. A girl might hold a bowl of water while her mother washed a wound, learning which herbs to pick or how to tie a bandage. Boys gathered firewood for boiling water or carried buckets to the stream. Illness didn't spare the young. They caught fevers, cut their feet, or burned their hands just like adults. A mother would treat her child with the same remedies, maybe singing softly to calm them, her voice blending with the crackle of the fire. It was care born of necessity, not choice, in a world where every injury could turn deadly. The seasons shaped the struggle. Summer brought rashes from heat and sweat, but also fresh herbs for remedies. Winter trapped illness in the hut, with no fresh air to clear the miasma. Coughs and colds spread fast, and firewood was too scarce to boil water for every need. Spring meant new plants to gather, but also mud and damp that worsened wounds. Autumn was a race to store herbs and food before the cold, with little time for tending the sick. Women bore the brunt, mixing remedies, binding wounds, and praying over fevered children, their hands never idle. The church loomed large. Illness was seen as God's will, a test or punishment. Priests urged prayer and repentance, but peasants mixed faith with practicality. A woman might pray to St. Roch for plague protection while smearing honey on a cut. Charms and relics were tucked into bedding or worn around the neck, despite the church's warnings. A village healer, often an older woman, knew more than the priest about herbs and wounds. But her work was eyed with suspicion, sometimes called witchcraft if it failed. This was the world of healing. A cut washed with muddy water, a fever fought. With bitter tea, a prayer whispered over a festering sore. Every remedy was a small act of defiance against death, done with rags, herbs, and stubborn hope. No one expected miracles, just another day to work, to live, to endure. We're turning now to how peasants managed their appearance hair. Clothes, skin not for vanity, but to avoid the sharp tongues of neighbors and the judging eyes at church. No mirrors, no soft brushes, no scented lotions, just rough tools, cold water, and endless effort to look just clean enough. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your bed, let your breaths grow heavy, and let's continue. If this calms you, give a sleepy sign, no need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. Appearance mattered in a medieval village, not for beauty, but for survival. A woman with tangled hair or a stained dress risked whispers of sloth or worse accusations of neglect that could mark her family as shameful. A man with a matted beard or muddy tunic might be mocked at the market, his work ethic questioned. Cleanliness wasn't about feeling fresh. It was about fitting in, about proving you could manage the endless tasks of life despite the dirt that clung to everything. Peasants, men, women, children, spent time each day on small acts of grooming. Not because they wanted to, but because the village expected it. Every comb stroke, every wiped face was a defense against judgment in a world where everyone watched. Let's start with hair. Hair was a battleground. Long, short, braided, or loose. It caught dirt, smoke, and lice like a net. Women especially faced pressure to keep their hair neat. Most wore it long, braided tightly or tucked under a cap or scarf to keep it out of the way. The cap wasn't just for modesty. It was a shield against dust, soot, and insects. A woman might spend a few minutes each morning combing her hair with a wooden comb, its teeth worn and uneven, or just her fingers if the comb was lost or broken. Combs were precious, carved from wood or bone, sometimes shared by the whole family. She'd sit by the fire or near the door for light, dragging the comb through knots, wincing as it caught on tangles. Dirt and grease came away, but so did strands of hair, leaving the comb gritty and the floor littered. Lice were a constant foe. They thrived in warm, crowded huts, jumping from head to head. A mother combed her children's hair daily, picking out bugs with her fingers or crushing them between her nails. It was tedious, done in the dim light of dawn or evening, the children squirming as she worked. For her own hair, she might ask a sister or neighbor for help, a rare moment of shared labor. Some used vinegar or herbal rinses, rosemary thyme, or nettle boiled in water to loosen lice or cut through grease. These rinses were poured over the head, cold and sharp-smelling, then wiped away with a rag. Washing hair fully was rare, maybe once a month, and only if water and firewood could be spared. Wet hair in a cold hut risked chills, so most relied on brushing and braiding, accepting the itch and grime as part of life. Men's hair was shorter, often cropped with a knife or shears by a family member. A man might run a comb through his hair or beard, scraping out dirt or bits of straw, but he spent less time on it. Beards were common, but they weren't style-just, trimmed to keep them from catching in tools or food. Boys learned to comb their own hair early, mimicking their fathers, while girls watched their mothers, learning to braid tightly or pin a cap in place. Hair washing, when it happened, was a family affair. A bucket of water, maybe warmed, was shared, each person dipping their head in turn. The water turned cloudy, flecked with dirt and lice, but it was used until the bucket was empty. Drying meant a rough cloth or just air. The hair left damp and heavy. Clothes were the next concern. Peasants owned few garments, a linen shift or two, a wool dress or tunic, maybe a cloak for winter. The shift, worn closest to the skin, was the workhorse. It soaked up sweat, oil, and dirt, protecting the outer clothes, which were too valuable to wash often. A woman might rinse her shift weekly, scrubbing it in a stream or basin with ashes or lye soap, her hands red from cold water. She'd wring it out, hang it near the fire, and wear it again, sometimes still damp. Outer garments, wool dresses, tunics, or aprons were cleaned less often, maybe once a season. Washing them meant a trip to the stream, where women knelt on rocks, pounding the fabric with stones or wooden paddles. The wool grew heavy when wet, hard to lift, and took days to dry. In winter, drying was nearly impossible, so clothes were brushed or beaten instead, the dirt falling in clouds. Stains were a problem. Blood, grease, or mud clung to fabric, and no amount of scrubbing could always remove them. Women used tricks, rubbing salt into bloodstains, soaking grease in vinegar, or scrubbing with sand for stubborn dirt. Patching was common. Holes were mended with scraps of cloth, sewn with coarse thread. A woman's dress might be a patchwork of repairs, each stitch a testament to thrift. Men's tunics were the same, patched at the knees or elbows, the fabric thinning with every year. Children wore hand-me-downs, often too big or too small, patched until they fell apart. Clean clothes were a sign of care, not wealth. A woman who appeared at church in a tidy dress, even if faded, earned nods of respect. Skin was the most visible marker. A clean face and hands were non-negotiable, especially for women. Each morning, a woman might splash her face with water from a bucket, rubbing it with a rag or her fingers. The water was cold, often cloudy, but it was enough to clear sleep's grit or yesterday's dust. Hands were scrubbed harder, nails scraped with a knife or twig to remove dirt from fieldwork or cooking. Men did the same, though less carefully, wiping their hands before eating or market days. Children were taught early to wash their faces. A mother guiding small hands to the basin, showing them how to rub without wasting water. Skin wasn't soft. Calluses, cracks, and burns were normal, worsened by cold winters or hot summers. Some women rubbed fat or grease into their hands to ease cracking, but it left a slick film, smelling of animals or rancid butter. Smell was a constant worry. Body odor was unavoidable, but too strong a smell drew gossip. Herbs were the main defense. A woman might tuck lavender or mint into her cap or shift, the dried leaves crumbling against her skin. Men chewed parsley or sage to freshen breath before church or market. Some rubbed herbal water, rosemary, or chamomile onto their necks or underarms, hoping to mask the sweat of a long day. These weren't luxuries, they were necessities, gathered from fields or gardens, dried in summer for year-round use. A small pouch of herbs tied to a belt or sewn into a dress. was a woman's quiet rebellion against the village's judgment. Children mirrored their parents. A girl learned to braid her hair, watching her mother's hands. A boy wiped his face before running to the fields, mimicking his father. By age 5, they were part of the routine, combing, wiping, or rinsing with the same scarce water. It wasn't about looking good. It was about looking respectable. A family with neat hair, clean hands, and patched but tidy clothes could hold their heads up at church or market, even if their huts smelled of smoke and their shoes were caked with mud. The seasons shaped these efforts. Summer meant more water for washing, but also more sweat and dust. Women braided hair tighter, men cropped theirs shorter. Winter made grooming harder, water froze, hands cracked, and clothes stayed damp. Spring brought fresh herbs, but muddy paths, staining shoes and hems. Autumn was a rush to prepare for winter, with less time for washing or combing. Women bore the brunt, their appearance scrutinized more than men's. A tidy cap, scrubbed face, a patched dress, these were her armor against whispers of sloth. The church added pressure. Cleanliness was next to godliness, but vanity was a sin. A woman might scrub her hands before Mass, not for comfort, but to avoid the priest's frown. Men brushed their tunics, children were pinched into tidiness. Major festivals, Easter, Christmas meant extra effort, a rinsed shift, a combed beard, a cap washed and dried. It was less about faith and more about community, about proving you belonged. This was the daily grind, a comb through tangled hair, a rag over a dusty face, a patched dress, pulled on with care. Every act was small, deliberate, and weighed against the cost of water, time, and energy. Clean wasn't the goal, just clean enough to pass, to blend, to survive the village's gaze. Let's pause here, in the faint morning light, where a woman ties her cap. Her hands rough but clean, her braid tight against the day's work. Next, we'll explore how peasants interacted with their community markets, churches, and gatherings where appearance and hygiene were judged, and small missteps could linger. For now, let your eyelids droop, let the hum of history fade, and let sleep settle over you. Picture a village square at midday, the air thick with the smell of bread, livestock, and unwashed bodies, voices murmuring as people gather for market or church. We're stepping now into the community markets, churches, festivals where hygiene wasn't just personal but public, a measure of your worth in the eyes of neighbors, priests, and strangers. No soap, no mirrors, just rags, water, and the desperate need to look respectable. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your blankets. Let your breaths grow slow, and let's wander through the crowded, judging world of the village. If this soothes you, give a sleepy nod. No need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. In a medieval village, community was everything. Your neighbors weren't just people. They were your judges, your allies, your survival. A family's reputation rested on small details: a clean face, a patched dress, a combed head of hair. To appear at market or church looking slovenly hair, tangled, hands filthy, clothes stained was to invite gossip that could linger for years. Women faced the sharpest scrutiny, their tidiness a sign of virtue, their neglect a mark of shame. Men weren't spared. Either a muddy tunic or a reeking body could brand a man as lazy, unfit for trade or trust. Children, too, were watched, their appearance reflecting their parents' care. Hygiene in public wasn't about comfort. It was about proving you belonged, proving you could keep up in a world that offered no mercy. The market was the heart of village life, a weekly or monthly gathering where peasants bartered eggs, wool, or grain. It was a stage, and everyone prepared. A woman might rise early, splashing her face with cold water, scrubbing her hands with a rag until they were red but clean. She'd comb her hair, braiding it tightly or pinning it under a cap. The linen faded but neat. Her dress, likely wool, was brushed free of straw or mud, its patches sewn carefully to avoid notice. If she had a spare shift, she'd wear it fresh, rinsed the day before and dried by the fire, its faint smell of smoke better than sweat. Men did the same, wiping their faces, combing beards, and shaking out tunics. A man might rub sage leaves on his teeth, hoping to mask the onions from last night's stew. Children were scrubbed, their faces pinched to ensure they looked tidy, their hair combed to hide lice. The walk to market was its own challenge. Muddy paths turned shoes and hems brown, undoing hours of effort. A woman might lift her skirts slightly, stepping carefully to avoid puddles, while a man trudged through, his boots caked but his hands clean for bartering. At the market, stalls were crowded, the air heavy with the smells of cheese, fish, and boadies pressed close. Sweat mixed with herbs, manure mingled with bread, and everyone noticed who smelled worse. A woman with a faint lavender scent from a pouch at her belt stood out, not for wealth, but for care. A man whose tunic was free of grease stains might get a better deal on grain. It wasn't about beauty, it was about signaling you weren't falling apart. Church was even stricter. Sunday Mass was a ritual of faith and judgment. The church taught cleanliness was next to godliness, but too much focus on appearance was vanity, a sin. Peasants walked a fine line. A woman might spend Saturday evening preparing rinsing her shift, scrubbing her neck, rebraiding her hair. Her cap was her shield, hiding grease or lice, its edges straightened to look crisp. Men brushed their cloaks, trimmed their beards with a knife, and wiped their boots on grass before entering. Children were lined up, faces washed, hands checked, for dirt under nails. The priest's eyes were sharp, and so were the congregation's. A stained dress or a whiff of unwashed body could spark whispers, especially for women whose virtue was tied to their tidiness. A family that looked put together, even if their clothes were patched, earned quiet approval. Festivals, Easter, Christmas, harvest feasts were the biggest tests. These were rare moments of celebration, but also public displays. Entire families prepared for days. Women boiled water, if firewood allowed, to rinse shifts or soak caps. Men mended shoes or brushed cloaks until they looked passable. Children were scrubbed until their cheeks glowed, their hair combed with extra care. A woman might crush mint or rosemary, rubbing it into her hands or neck, hoping the scent lasted through the day. Some saved a precious scrap of lye soap, harsh and burning, to scrub their faces before the feast. The goal wasn't to shine. It was to blend in, to avoid being the one pointed at when the village gathered. Public hygiene extended beyond appearance. Behavior mattered too. Spitting in church was frowned upon, though men did it anyway, aiming for the floor or outside the door. Women were more discreet, swallowing or using a rag if they had to. Eating at festivals meant shared bowls or trenchers wooden. Plates passed hand to hand. A dirty hand dipping into the stew drew glares, so washing before eating was a must, even if just a quick rinse in a communal bucket. Relieving oneself during gatherings was tricky. No public latrines existed, so people slipped away to ditches or bushes, women especially careful to avoid being seen. A woman might wait hours, holding it until she could find a private spot. Her modesty more important than comfort. Children learned these rules early. A girl watched her mother prepare for market, learning to pin her cap just right. A boy saw his father wipe his hands before trading, copying the gesture. By age 7, children were expected to look tidy in public, their faces scrubbed, their clothes free of obvious stains. They carried small tasks, holding a comb, fetching water, or brushing a sibling's tunic. Learning that appearance was a family effort. A child with matted hair or a muddy face shamed not just themselves but their parents, a lesson taught with a stern word or a pinch. The seasons shaped these rituals. Summer markets were dusty, sweat soaking through shifts, but water was easier to get. Women carried herbal pouches to mask odors. Men cropped their hair to stay cool. Winter made preparation harder. Frozen water, damp clothes, and cracked hands from cold. A woman might rub grease into her skin to stop it splitting, the smell of fat clinging to her as she walked to church. Spring brought mud, staining everything, but also fresh herbs for scent. Autumn was a rush of harvest work, leaving little time for grooming, yet festivals demanded it. Women bore the heavier burden, their appearance a mirror of their household's worth. The church's influence was strong. Priests preached cleanliness as a virtue, but warned against pride. A woman who looked too polished risked being called vain. One too unkempt was slothful. Men faced less judgment, but a filthy tunic could still draw a priest's scolding. Before major holy days, families made extra effort washing faces, rinsing clothes, combing hair to show devotion through order. Some prayed over their preparations, asking saints for protection, their hands busy with rags and combs as they whispered. Gossip was the real enforcer. A neighbor's whisper could ruin a family's standing. A woman whose cap was always dirty might be shunned at the well. A man who smelled too strongly might lose a trade. Children heard it all, learning to fear the village's eyes. Every trip to market or church was a performance, a chance to prove you weren't the weakest link. A clean hand, a neat braid, a brushed cloak, these were small victories, won with effort and guarded fiercely. This was the dance of community life. A woman scrubbing her face at dawn, a man brushing his tunic, a child combed until they squirmed. Every act was weighed against the village's gaze, every detail a shield against judgment. Clean wasn't the goal, just clean enough to pass, to stand in the crowd without a whisper trailing behind. Picture a village at noon, the air heavy with the scent of earth, smoke, and toil. The sound of clanging tools and creaking carts in the distance. We're stepping now into the workspace's fields, kitchens, looms where peasants spent their days battling grime that clung to everything they touched. No cleaning sprays, no rubber gloves, just rags, water, and hands worn raw from scrubbing. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your covers. Let your breaths grow heavy, and let's wander through the endless labor of keeping work functional, if not clean. If this calms you, give a sleepy sigh. No need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. Work was the heart of peasant life, and every workspace was a source of dirt. Fields, kitchens, and looms weren't just places to labor. They were battlegrounds where grime won more often than not. Men, women, and children shared these tasks, each fighting to keep tools usable and spaces bearable, knowing that cleanliness was a luxury they couldn't afford. Dirt wasn't just an annoyance, it was a fact of life. Ground into hands, clothes, and tools, a constant reminder of the earth they depended on. Every act of cleaning was weighed against time, water, and energy, all of which were scarce. The goal wasn't spotless, was enough to keep working, to keep surviving. Let's start with the fields, where most peasants spent their days. Fields were vast, muddy expanses tilled with plows, sown with grain, or weeded by hand. Men guided plows pulled by oxen or horses, their boots sinking into soil wet with rain or manure. Women and children followed, planting seeds or pulling weeds, their hands and knees coated in dirt. The tools, wooden plows, iron hoes, sickles, were heavy, their handles worn smooth but sticky with sweat and earth. Cleaning them was a necessity, not for looks but for function. A clogged plow or a dull sickle slowed work, and a slow day meant less food. After a day's labor, a man might scrape mud from the plow with a stick or stone, wiping the blade with a rag or a handful of straw. Water was rarely used, too precious to waste on tools, so dirt was knocked off or left to cake until it flaked away. Women working the fields faced the same mess. Weeding or harvesting meant crawling through dirt, skirts dragging in the mud. They tied their dresses up, but hems still turned brown, stained with soil or plant sap. At day's end, a woman might shake out her skirt, beating it with her hands or a stick, but the stains stayed. Hands were worse caked with earth, nails black with grime. A quick rinse in a stream or bucket was all they could manage. The water, cold and often muddy itself. Children sent to gather stones or scare birds came back just as dirty, their bare feet crusted, their tunics smeared. A mother might wipe their hands before they ate, but the dirt under nails or in hair stayed, a badge of the day's work. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was another mess. Most peasant homes had no separate kitchen, just a hearth in the center of the hut, a cauldron or pot, and a few wooden bowls. Cooking was women's work, a daily grind of boiling pottage, baking bread, or roasting meat when they had it. Hearth was a source of constant grime. Ashes spilled, grease splattered, and smoke coated everything in a fine black film. A woman stirring a pot might burn her hand, the grease sticking to her skin, or spill broth onto the floor, where it soaked into the dirt or rushes. Cleaning the hearth meant sweeping ashes into a pile, scooping them into a bucket, or tossing them outside. The ashes were saved, used for washing or fertilizing, but they left a gritty residue on. Hands and clothes, pots and utensils were scrubbed with whatever was at hand. A woman might use a rag or straw, dipped in water or mixed with ashes, to scrape out burned stew or grease. Sand was another tool, gritty and abrasive, rubbed against clay pots or wooden spoons. Iron cauldrons, rare and prized, were wiped carefully to avoid rust, but they were never truly clean. The inside blackened from years of fire. Water for washing was scarce, often reused from other tasks, so pots stayed slick with a faint film of fat. Bowls and spoons were wiped rather than soaked, the wood-absorbing smells of onion or barley. Spills on the floor were swept into the rushes or left to dry, adding to the hut's ever-present dirt. Looms, for those who wove, were just as bad. Spinning and weaving were women's tasks, done in the hut or a corner of the yard. Wool or flax was spun into thread, then woven into cloth on a wooden loom. The process was dusty. Wool shed fibers, flax left bits of chaff, and both clung to clothes and skin. A woman's hands grew rough from handling raw wool, the lanolin sticking to her fingers, or dry from flax, which cracked her skin. The loom itself was a magnet for dust and grease, the wooden frame sticky from sweaty hands or spilled oil used to lubricate it. Cleaning it meant wiping it with a rag, maybe damp if water was available, but often dry, just spreading the dirt around. Thread broke, tangling in knots that had to be picked apart, leaving bits of fiber on the floor or in the air. Tools for spinning: spindles, distaffs were no cleaner. A woman might spin while sitting by the fire, the spindle twirling, gathering dust, or ash as it fell. If she dropped it, it rolled into the rushes, picking up crumbs or fleas. She'd brush it off, keep going, her hands gritty by day's end. The finished cloth was beaten to remove dust, hung outside to air, but washing it was rare. Too much water, too much time. The loom's output line in shifts. Wool tunics was vital, but the process left the hut dustier, the air thick with floating fibers that settled into bedding or food. Children were part of this too. A boy might carry water for rinsing a pot, his small hands struggling with the bucket's weight. A girl learned to sweep the hearth or shake out a woven cloth, mimicking her mother. By age 8, they were working alongside adults, their tunics stained with mud from the fields or grease from the kitchen. Cleaning wasn't a separate task. It was woven into the day, done in stolen moments between planting, cooking, or weaving. A woman might pause to scrape a pot while the stew simmered, or a man might wipe a sickle while catching his breath in the field. Children followed, learning that dirt was normal, but too much dirt was a problem. The seasons made it harder. Summer. Fields were dusty, coating tools and clothes in fine grit. Sweat mixed with dirt, leaving streaks on faces and hands. Kitchens were hotter, grease sticking faster, flies buzzing around spills. Winter turned fields to mud, tools caked with frozen earth, impossible to clean without warm water. Kitchens grew smokier, the hearth's ash piling higher in the cold. Spring brought wet soil, clinging to plows and boots, while autumn's harvest left chaff and stalks scattered everywhere. Women, who managed most indoor tasks, bore the brunt, their hands raw from scrubbing pots or wiping looms. Men, in the fields, accepted dirt as part of the job. Their tools cleaned just enough to work. The church had little to say about workspaces, except to urge diligence. A neglected field or a filthy hearth could be seen as sloth, a sin. Women faced more judgmenta. Greasy kitchen reflected on her worth as a wife or mother. Men were judged by their tools. A dull sickle or a broken plow suggested laziness. Before festivals, families might clean their workspaces extra hard, sweeping the hearth, wiping tools, or airing woven cloth. Not for comfort, but to show the village they were capable. Community watched closely. A neighbor might note a muddy plow or a greasy pot, whispering about a family's struggle. Markets were a chance to show off tools polished, clothes brushed, hands scrubbed, but also a place to be judged. A woman whose apron was too stained might be offered less for her eggs. A man whose hoe was caked in dirt might be seen as careless. Cleanliness in work wasn't about pride. It was about trust, about proving you could handle the labor that kept the village alive. This was the endless cycle. A man scraping mud from a plow, a woman scrubbing a pot with ash, a child sweeping chaff from a loom. Every workspace was a source of dirt, every tool a carrier of grime. Clean wasn't the goal, just usable, just enough to keep the work going, to keep the village fed and clothed. Picture a village at dusk, the air thick with the scent of damp straw, animal dung, and fading wood smoke, the faint sound of buckets clanging as someone hauls waste to a ditch. We're diving now into the messy business of waste management. Food, scraps, animal manure, human refusal, the things peasants had to handle without sewers, bins, or any modern convenience. It was a daily chore, shared by men, women, and children, each doing their part to keep the hut and village livable. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your blankets, let your breaths grow slow, and let's wander through the endless task of dealing with what was left behind. If this soothes you, give a sleepy sign. No need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. Waste was everywhere in a medieval village. Nothing was thrown away, not because of virtue, but because survival demanded thrift. Food scraps, animal dung, human waste, everything had a use, or at least a place to go, even if that place was just a ditch or a pile outside the hut. The peasant's world was a cycle of use and reuse, where every scrap was weighed for its value before it was discarded. But managing waste was a constant battle, fought with buckets, shovels, and hands already tired from other work. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about keeping the mess from overwhelming the home, the yard, the village. Every pile of refuse, every spilled pot, was a reminder of how close chaos always was. Start with food scraps. Peasant meals were simple pottage. Of barley or beans, coarse bread, maybe onions or cabbage. Nothing went to waste. Crust of bread too hard to eat was soaked in broth or fed to the chickens. Vegetable peels, turnip skins, onion tops were tossed into the stew or given to pigs. Bones from a rare bit of meat were boiled for broth, then cracked for marrow or thrown to dogs. If a scrap couldn't be eaten by humans or animals, it went to the fire, where it burned with a hiss, adding to the hut's smoky haze. Women who did most of the cooking were the gatekeepers of scraps. A woman might sweep crumbs from the floor into a pile, deciding what went to the pigs, what to the fire, what to the compost heap. Children helped, gathering peelings or carrying bones to the animals, their small hands sticky with grease. The compost heap was a lifeline. Outside the hut, near the garden or yard, was a pile of scraps, vegetable peels, straw, ash, sometimes manure. It wasn't organized like a modern compost bin, just a heap that grew over weeks, buzzing with flies in summer, freezing in winter. Women and children added to it daily, tossing in cabbage leaves or spoiled grain. Men might turn it with a pitchfork, mixing in manure to enrich it for the fields. The heap smelled sour, earthy, sometimes rotting, but it was vital. Come spring, it was spread over the garden or fields, feeding the soil that fed the family. Keeping it contained was the challenge. A stray dog or pig could scatter it, leaving a mess to clean up. A woman might scold a child for not piling it neatly, her voice sharp but tired. Animal manure was another constant. Pigs, cows, goats, chickens all left their mark, in the yard, the pen, or even inside the hut during winter. Manure was a resource, not waste, used to fertilize fields or gardens. Men and boys shoveled it from pens or stalls, piling it into heaps or carts. The work was heavy, the smell overwhelming, especially in summer when the sun baked the piles dry. A wooden shovel or pitchfork, worn from years of use, scooped the muck, but it stuck to tools, boots, and hands. Women rarely shoveled, but often dealt with the aftermath, sweeping straw mixed with droppings, wiping boots, or rinsing buckets. Children were roped in early. A boy as young as 6 hauling a bucket of manure to the heap, a girl scattering straw to cover fresh droppings in the pen. The manure pile was a village landmark, often shared by several households. A stinking mound that grew until planting season, human waste was the hardest to manage. Without sewers or toilets, peasants used chamber pots or went outside. Chamber pots, clay, wood, or cracked metal, sat in the hut's corner, used by the whole family. At night, when it was too cold or risky to go out, everyone took turns, the pot filling with a sour, heavy smell. Emptying it was a daily chore, usually for women or children. A woman might carry it to a ditch or stream, pouring it out and rinsing it with a splash of water, if she could spare it. In winter, the contents froze, making the pot harder to clean. In summer, flies swarmed, and the smell lingered in the hut. Some families dug a pit near the hut, a crude latrine covered with a board or straw. It was emptied when full, the contents mixed with the manure heap or spread in the fields, but digging was hard work, often left to men. Outside, waste went to ditches, streams, or fields. Women, bound by modesty, sought privacy, squatting behind bushes or waiting for dark. Men were less careful, using the edge of a field or a wall. Children learned to do the same, taught to avoid being seen. Streams were a problem used for washing, drinking, and waste. They carried refuse downstream, where it fouled someone else's water. Villages sometimes had rules about where to dump waste, but enforcement was lax. A woman caught pouring a chamber pot too close to the well might face a neighbor's scolding. But most just looked away, knowing they did the same. Cleaning up after waste was grim. Buckets and pots were rinsed with water, often reused from other tasks, leaving a faint smell. Women scrubbed with straw or rags, their hands raw from cold water or ash. Men cleaned shovels or pitchforks, scraping off manure with a stick or stone. Children carried buckets, their arms aching, or swept straw over spills in the yard. Water was the biggest hurdle. Rinse meant a trip to the well or stream, a heavy bucket hauled through mud or frost. In winter, snow might be melted for cleaning, but it was slow, and firewood was scarce. Summer brought more water, but also more flies, more rot, more stench. The seasons shaped the task. Summer turned waste piles into fly-ridden messes. The smell, drifting across the village. Winter froze manure in chamber pots, making them harder to empty but less odorous. Spring meant cleaning out pens and heaps for planting, a back-breaking job for men and boys. Autumn was a rush to clear waste before the cold, with women and children hauling scraps to the compost. Women bore the indoor burden emptying pots, sweeping floors while men handled the heavier outdoor tasks. Children did both, learning early that waste was everyone's problem. The church had its say. Waste was tied to sin sloth. If you let it pile up, pride if you fussed too much about cleanliness. Priests urged moderation, but peasants cared more. About practicality. A tidy yard or hut was a sign of diligence, noticed by neighbors. A woman whose chamber pot overflowed risked gossip. A man with a neglected manure pile might be seen as careless. Festivals meant extra effort, clearing waste, sweeping yards, airing huts to look respectable for the village. Community. Judgment was relentless. A neighbor might wrinkle their nose at a foul-smelling hut, whispering about laziness. At market. A woman with clean hands and a tidy apron stood a better chance of selling her eggs. Men traded better if their tools and clothes weren't caked in manure. Waste management wasn't just practical, it was social, a way to prove you weren't failing, weren't letting the village down. This was the cycle. A woman pouring a chamber pot into a ditch. A man shoveling manure. A child sweeping scraps into a pile. Every act was small, smelly, and vital, done with tools that barely worked and water that was never enough. Clean wasn't the goal, just manageable, just enough to keep the hut livable. The village bearable. Let's pause here, in the dim yard, where a woman rinses a chamber pot, her hands cold and wet, the dusk hiding her work. Next, we'll explore how peasants dealt with death and burial, cleaning bodies, preparing graves, and managing laws in a world where even death was messy. For now, let your thoughts soften, let the drone of history fade, and let sleep take hold. If you're tucked into bed, the room soft and dark, let this slow, droning tale of death, burial, and somber chores lull you closer to sleep. Picture a village at twilight, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint musk of decay, a bell tolling faintly from the church. We're stepping now into the realm of death, how peasants prepared bodies, dug graves, and managed loss in a world where even the end of life was messy, tied to the same struggles of dirt and scarcity. No undertakers, no sterile morgues, just rags, water, and hands worn from labor. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your blankets. Let your breaths grow heavy, a tea, and let's wander through the quiet, grim tasks of death. If this soothes you, give a sleepy sign. No need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. Death was no stranger in a medieval village. Disease, injury, hunger, or age took lives, often children, adults, elders. None were spared. When someone died, the family took on the burden of preparing the body, a task as practical as it was sacred. Hygiene, already a struggle in life, carried into death. A body had to be cleaned, dressed, and buried, all while the living grappled with grief and the ever-present dirt of their world. Women led this work, washing and wrapping the dead, while men dug graves or built coffins. Children watched or helped, learning the rituals early, their small hands folding cloths or carrying water. Every act was slow, deliberate, shaped by scarcity, and the need to honor the dead without wasting resources. When death came, the first task was cleaning the body. A woman, often the mother, wife, or sister of the deceased, would fetch water cold from the well or stream, rarely warmed, as firewood was too precious. The body was laid on a straw mat or a wooden table, if the family had one, in the dim light of the hut. Using a rag, maybe the same one used for dishes or faces, she'd wipe the body, starting with the face and hands, then moving to the arms, legs, and torso. The water turned gray with dirt or sweat, sometimes blood if death came from injury. No soap was used unless the family was unusually wealthy. Instead, the rag was dipped and wrung out over and over until the body looked presentable. If the death was messy disease, childbirth, or a wound, the task was grim, the rag soaking up fluids that smelled of decay. Women worked quietly, their hands steady despite the weight of loss. Herbs were often part of the process. Lavender, rosemary, or mint, dried from summer, were crushed and rubbed onto the body or tucked into the cloth, wrapping it. These weren't for scent alone. They were believed to ward off evil spirits or mask the odor of death, which came quickly in a warm hut. A woman might sprinkle herb-infused water over the body, murmuring a prayer or a charm, blending faith with practicality. The church frowned on charms, but peasants used them anyway, a quiet defiance born of fear and tradition. If herbs were scarce, ashes from the hearth might be used, their faint smell better than nothing. The goal wasn't cleanliness, but dignity. Making the body fit for burial and the eyes of the village. Dressing the body was next. Most peasants owned few clothes, so the deceased was wrapped in their best shift or tunic, often the one they wore to church. If the family could spare it, the cloth was rinsed beforehand, scrubbed with ashes or lye soap to look fresh, though stains and wear remained. Women folded the cloth carefully, wrapping the body tightly to hide bloating or discoloration. Some used old linen torn into strips as a shroud, tying it with cords or thread. Men rarely helped with this, but they might mend a cloak or tunic for the burial, their stitches uneven but sturdy. Children watched, learning to fold or tie, their small fingers clumsy but eager. In poorer families, no cloth was spared. Body was buried bare or in rags, a grim reminder of scarcity. The coffin, if there was one, was a luxury. Most peasants were buried in a shroud, but a man with carpentry skills might build a simple box from rough wood, oak, or pine, splintered and unpolished. Building it meant hours of work, cutting and nailing by firelight, the wood dust mixing with the hut's ash and dirt. The coffin was lined with straw or old cloth, the body laid inside with care. If no coffin was possible, the body was carried to the grave on a board or in a cart, wrapped tightly to keep it secure. Men handled this, their hands rough from tools, while women prepared the body inside. Children might carry straw or hold a candle, their faces solemn as they followed. Digging the grave was men's work, done in the churchyard or a village burial ground. The ground was hard, often rocky or frozen in winter, and shovels were crude wooden with iron tips, worn from years of use. 2 or 3 men worked together, digging a shallow pit, just deep enough to keep animals away. The dirt piled up, muddy or dry, sticking to boots and hands. Women rarely dug, but they might help carry the body or sprinkle herbs into the grave. Children watched from a distance, learning the rhythm of the shovel, the weight of the task. The church oversaw burials, a priest saying prayers. But the labor was the family's. A shallow grave was a risk dogs or wolves could dig it up, so men packed the earth tightly. Sometimes adding stones. The seasons made death harder. Hastened decay, the body bloating within hours, flies gathering unless herbs or cloths were used. Women worked faster, washing and wrapping before the smell grew too strong. Winter slowed decay but froze the ground, making graves harder to dig. Men chipped at icy soil, their breath clouding, while women wrapped the body in extra cloth to keep it warm for the soul's sake. Spring brought mud, graves filling with water, while autumn's chill preserved bodies longer but left less time. For preparation amid harvest work, women bore the emotional weight, cleaning and dressing with care. While men's labor was physical, their shovels breaking the earth. The church shaped the rituals. Death was God's will, and burial was sacred, requiring prayers and blessings. A priest might sprinkle holy water, but peasants added their own touches, herbs, charms, or a coin tucked into the shroud for luck in the afterlife. The church disapproved of such practices, calling them pagan, but they persisted, whispered in huts and gravesides. A woman might pray to St. Margaret for a mother lost in childbirth, or St. Roch for one taken by plague, her hands busy with rags as she spoke. Men prayed too, but their focus was the grave, the shovel, the earth. Community played a role. Neighbors helped dig or carry, but they also judged. A body poorly prepared, dirty, badly wrapped could spark gossip about a family's neglect. A woman whose shroud was stained might be whispered about, her grief overshadowed by shame. Men faced less scrutiny, but a shallow grave or a rough coffin could mark them as careless. Children learned to stay quiet, to help without drawing attention. Funerals were public, the village gathering to pray or mourn, their eyes noting every detail: the cleanness of the shroud, the depth of the grave, the family's composure. Grief didn't stop the work. A woman might weep as she washed a child's body, but she'd still scrub, still wrap, still pray. A man might dig his wife's grave, his hands blistered, but he'd keep going, knowing the village watched. Children carried water or straw, their small faces set, learning that death was just another chore. The mess of death, blood, decay, dirt was handled with the same tools as life: rags, buckets, hands. Nothing was wasted, not even grief. This was the rhythm: a woman washing a body by firelight, a man digging in the cold earth, a child folding a shroud. Every act was heavy, practical, and tied to the village's eyes, the church's rules, the earth's demands. Clean wasn't the goal just enough to honor the dead, to bury them without shame. Picture a village at dawn, the air cool and damp. The faint sound of splashing water as someone trudges back from a stream, bucket in hand. We're diving now into the lifeblood of the village. Water, how peasants fetched it, carried it, and used it sparingly for washing, cooking, and drinking in a world where every drop was hard-earned and rarely clean. No faucets, no pipes, just heavy buckets, muddy paths, and hands worn from hauling. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your covers, let your breaths grow heavy, and let's wander through the endless labor of water. If this soothes you, give a sleepy sigh. No need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history. Made for sleep, water was the foundation of life. But getting it was a daily struggle. Medieval villages relied on wells, streams, or rivers, each with its own challenges. A communal well might sit in the village center, its stone rim worn smooth by ropes and hands, but it wasn't always reliable. In dry summers, wells ran low, forcing longer walks to streams or rivers, sometimes a mile away. Streams were closer in some villages, winding through meadows or woods, but they were shared with animals. Laundry and waste. Their water often cloudy with silt or worse. Rivers were broader, their flows stronger, but they carried the refuse of upstream villages' manure, scraps, or human waste. Every source demanded labor, and every bucket was a small victory, fought for by men, women, and children, their hands and backs aching from the weight. Fetching water was women's work, though men and children helped when needed. A woman might rise at dawn, her breath clouding in the cold, and walk to the well or stream with a wooden bucket or clay jug. Buckets were heavy, made of oak staves, bound with iron or rope, weighing several pounds, empty. Filled with water, they could weigh 30 pounds or more, pulling at arms and shoulders as she trudged home. The path was rarely easy, muddy in spring, rutted in summer, icy in winter. A slip could spill half the bucket. Hours of work lost in a moment. She'd curse, quietly refill, and start again. Her skirt damp from splashes, her hands red from the cold handle. Children, as young as 6, carried smaller jugs. Their steps slow but steady, learning early that water was never free. At the well, the work wasn't just hauling. A rope, often frayed, was lowered with a bucket or leather pouch, pulled up hand over hand. The well's depth, sometimes 20 feet or more, made it slow, the rope cutting into palms. If the well was communal, women waited their turn. Gossiping or silent, their buckets lined up like soldiers. Streams were less formal, but messier. A woman knelt on the bank, dipping her bucket, avoiding the muddy edge where cows drank or clothes were washed. The water might be brown with silt, flecked with leaves or dung, but it was all she had. Filtering was rare ray cloth over the bucket's mouth, if she was careful, to catch the worst debris. Most just carried it home, letting the dirt settle or ignoring it entirely. Once home, water was rationed like gold. A single bucket might serve the whole day, cooking, drinking, washing, and watering animals. A woman poured carefully, measuring out just enough for each task. Washing was the lowest priority. A splash for faces, a dip for hands, maybe a rag soaked for wiping a child's feet. Cooking took more pottage or bread needed water, boiled if the family could spare the firewood. Drinking water was kept in a clay jug, covered with a cloth to keep out flies, but it was never pure. Tiny bits of dirt or bugs floated in it, sipped without complaint. Animals got the dregs, poured into a trough or a bucket, their snouts muddying it further. Every drop was used, reused, stretched until it was gone. Cleaning with water was a luxury. A woman might wipe her face with a damp rag, the same water used later to rinse a pot or soak a cloth. Bathing, as we know it, was rare, maybe once a month, if at all. A wooden tub, if the family had one, was filled bucket by bucket, a process that could take hours. The water was shared, men first, then children, then women, until it was murky and cold. Most relied on spot cleaning face, hands, underarms using a basin or just a rag dipped in a bucket. Clothes were washed even less, a shift rinsed weekly. Outer garments maybe once a season. The stream was better for laundry, women kneeling together, pounding wool or linen against rocks, their hands raw from cold water and ashes used as soap. Water quality was a constant worry. Wells could be fouled by a dead bird or runoff from a manure pile. Streams carried waste from upstream animal dung, human refuse, or laundry soap. Peasants drank it anyway, boiling it when possible, though firewood was scarce. Illness from bad water fevers, stomach pains was common, blamed on spirits or sign rather than germs. A woman might strain water through a cloth or let it sit to settle, but it was never clear. Some added herbsmint or chamomile to mask the taste, but these were saved for special days or sickness. Children learned to drink without flinching, their small hands clutching jugs as they sipped. The seasons shaped the struggle. Summer dried wells and streams, forcing longer walks to find water. Flies swarmed, landing on buckets, and algae bloomed in stagnant pools. Winter froze buckets and wells, the ice chipped away with a knife or warmed with precious firewood. Women carried water in smaller amounts, their hands numb, the path slick with frost. Spring brought floods, streams swollen and muddy, buckets filled with grit. Autumn was a race to store water before the cold, with barrels or jugs kept in the hut, often leaking or growing mold. Women bore the brunt, their days structured around fetching, carrying, rationing. Men helped with heavier loads or digging wells, their shovels breaking hard earth. Children carried small jugs or held buckets steady, their arms trembling, but learning, the church had its influence. Water was sacred, used in baptisms and blessings, but also practical. Needed for rituals like washing before Mass. Priests urged care with wells, warning against fouling God's gift, but peasants had little choice. A woman might pray over a bucket, asking for purity, but she'd still use it, silt and all. Community judgment was harsher. A family with a dirty jug or a fouled well risked gossip, their carelessness a mark of shame. At market, a woman with clean hands and a tidy bucket was trusted more, her eggs or cheese selling faster. Men, too, were judged dirty tools or a muddy cart suggested laziness. Water shaped every part of life. A woman hauling a bucket through mud, a man digging a new well. A child splashing a rag in a basin, these were the small, endless acts that kept the family alive. Every drop was a calculation, every trip a chore, every use a reminder of scarcity. Clean water was a dream. Usable water was enough. Asterisk. Picture a village under a heavy sky, the air thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and the faint tang of unwashed bodies, voices low as people bow to a passing lord or nod to a priest. We're exploring now the social hierarchy. How peasants navigated their place among lords, clergy, and neighbors, where hygiene and appearance were not just personal, but a signal of status, even for the poorest. No fine soaps, no tailored clothes, just rags, water, and the constant pressure to look respectable. This is a longer tale, our last. So sink deeper into your blankets, let your breaths grow heavy, and let's wander through the judging eyes of the medieval world. If this soothes you, give a sleepy sign. No need to stir, no need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. In a medieval village, everyone had a place, and hygiene helped mark it. Lords, priests, and wealthier. Villagers stood above, their cleaner clothes and fresher scents a sign of power. Peasants, scraping by at the bottom, used what little they had: water, rags, herbs to mimic respectability, not for pride, but for survival. A woman with a tidy cap or a man with a brushed tunic could avoid scorn, maybe even gain a nod from a lord or priest. But the effort was endless. Every act of cleaning weighed against the cost of water, time, and energy. Neighbors watched closest, their whispers sharper than any lord's command. Hygiene wasn't about comfort. It was about signaling you weren't the lowest, weren't failing in a world that judged every stain. Lords were distant but powerful. They lived in manors with more water, more cloth, maybe even soap made from fat and ash. Their clothes, wool, tunics, linen shirts, were cleaner, washed by servants who had access to better wells or streams. A peasant meeting a lord, perhaps to pay rent or deliver grain, knew their appearance mattered. A woman would scrub her hands raw, her face splashed with cold water, her cap pinned tightly to hide greasy hair. A man brushed his cloak, wiping mud from his boots with straw or a rag. Children were pinched into tidiness, their faces scrubbed until they glowed, their tunics free of obvious dirt. To stand before a lord looking slovenly risked a tongue lashing, or worse, a fine, more work, or eviction. A clean face, even if the shift beneath was worn, showed deference. A silent plea for mercy. Priests held a different power. They preached cleanliness as a virtue, a sign of godliness, but warned against vanity. A peasant family at church faced the priest's gaze, his sermons tying a tidy appearance to a pure soul. Women felt this most. A woman with a stained dress or tangled hair might be called out, her virtue questioned in front of the congregation. She'd prepare carefully for Sunday Mass, rinsing her shift, combing her hair, rubbing mint or rosemary into her hands for a faint, clean scent. Men were less scrutinized, but still brushed their tunics, combed their beards, and wiped their hands before taking bread at communion. Children were lined up, faces washed, hair braided or cropped, their small hands checked for dirt. A family that looked orderly, even if patched and faded, earned the priest's approval, a small shield against village gossip. Neighbors were the harshest judges. In a village where everyone knew each other's business, a dirty cap or a smelly tunic was ammunition. Women bore the brunt. A greasy apron or a muddy hem could brand her as lazy, her household sloppy. She'd scrub her face, pin her cap just right, and brush her dress before market, knowing eyes were on her. Men faced it too. A farmer with a filthy cloak might be mocked, his trade offers ignored. At the market, cleanliness was currency. Woman with clean hands and a neat basket sold her eggs faster. A man with a brushed tunic got better deals on grain. Children learned early to look tidy in public, their mothers wiping their faces or combing their hair before they left the hut. A family that looked put together, even if their clothes were threadbare, held their heads higher. Festivals amplified the pressure. Harvest feasts, weddings, or holy days were public stages. Women spent days preparing washing shifts, scrubbing faces, sewing patches to look less worn. Men mended boots or cloaks, their hands clumsy with needle and thread. Children were scrubbed until they squirmed, their hair braided or cropped, their tunics brushed free of straw. Herbs were crushed lavender, sage, thyme and tucked into clothes or rubbed on skin to mask sweat. Some saved a scrap of lye soap, harsh and burning, to clean their hands or faces before the event. The goal wasn't beauty, but blending in, avoiding the whispers that followed a stained dress or a whiff of unwashed body. Social roles shaped the effort. Women, as keepers of the home, were judged on their tidiness and their families. A clean hearth, a neat child, a washed shift, these were her reputation. She'd rise early, splashing water on her face, combing her hair, checking her children's hands before church or market. Men's hygiene was tied to work a farmer's clean tools, or a shepherd's brushed cloak showed he was reliable. Children mirrored their parents, learning to wash their faces or brush their tunics to avoid shame. Older children helped younger ones, a girl braiding her sister's hair, a boy wiping his brother's hands. It was a family effort, each act a small defense against the village's eyes. The seasons complicated it all. Summer brought sweat, dust clinging to clothes and skin. Women carried herbal pouches to mask odors. Men cropped their hair shorter. Winter froze water, cracked hands, and made washing a misery. A woman might rub grease into her skin to stop it splitting, the smell of fat lingering as she walked to church. Spring's mud-stained hems and boots, while autumn's harvest left little time for grooming. Women bore the heavier burden, their appearance a constant test. A tidy cap, a scrubbed face, a patched dress, these were her proof of worth, worn. Like armor, the church's rules were strict but vague. Cleanliness was godly, but too much care was vanity. Priests might scold a woman for a dirty cap or praise a man for a neat tunic, but the line was blurry. Before major holy days, Easter, Christmas, families made extra effort, rinsing clothes, combing hair, washing hands to honor the occasion. Charms, like a sprig of rosemary or a prayer whispered over a bucket, were common despite the church's frowns. Peasants mixed faith and practicality. Praying for favor while scrubbing with ash. Gossip was the true enforcer. A neighbor's whisper could ruin a family's standing, a woman's stained apron, a man's muddy boots, a child's tangled hair. At market, a clean appearance meant better trades. At church, it meant fewer stares. Women especially lived under this weight. There, every step judged. A tidy family was a respected family, even if their hut was smoky and their clothes patched. This was the dance of hierarchy. A woman pinning her cap, a man brushing his cloak, a child scrubbing their hands. Every act was small, deliberate, a signal to lords, priests, and neighbors that they weren't failing, weren't the lowest. Clean wasn't the goal, just enough to stand tall, to pass through the village without a whisper trailing behind. We're stepping now into the world of sleep and rest, how peasants prepared for bed, managed their bedding, and faced hygiene challenges even in the quiet hours of night. No soft pillows, no clean sheets, just straw, rags, and the constant battle against dirt and vermin. This is a longer tale, so sink deeper into your blankets. Let your breaths grow heavy, and let's wander through the dim, restless nights of the medieval world. If this soothes you, give a sleepy no need to stir. No need to think. This is boring history, made for sleep. Sleep was a precious escape for peasants, but it came with its own burdens. After a day of hauling water, tending fields, or scrubbing pots, the body craved rest, but the hut offered little comfort. Beds were simple straw stuffed into sacks, wooden frames if the family was lucky, or just a pile of rushes on the earthen floor. Hygiene didn't stop at night. It followed into the bedding, the air, the very act of lying down. Dirt, sweat, and vermin clung to everything. And preparing for sleep meant wrestling with the same scarcity of water, time, and tools that defined the day. Men, women, and children shared this task, each doing their part to make the night bearable. Knowing that rest was never truly clean or quiet, the bed itself was a source of grime. Most peasants slept on straw mattresses sewn into coarse linen or wool sacks, laid on the floor or a low wooden frame. Straw was cheap, gathered from fields after harvest, but it was far from clean. It came with dust, chaff, and tiny bugs, packed tightly but never fully settled. Over time, the straw broke down, turning to dust that coated skin and clothes. A woman might shake out the mattress weakly, beating it with a stick or her hands, clouds of dust rising in the dim hut. The sack was patched when it tore, the stitches rough but necessary, as fabric was precious. Wealthier families might have a second mattress or a wool blanket, but these were rare. And even they grew greasy from sweat and body oils. Bedding was shared often by the whole family. A single mattress might hold a mother, father, and children, their bodies pressed close for warmth in winter. Privacy was non-existent. Everyone slept in their shifts. The same linen undergarments worn all day, soaked with the day's sweat, dirt, or grease. A woman might rinse her shift before bed, if water was available, hanging it to dry by the fire, but it was often still damp when she slipped it back on. Men rarely bothered, their tunics or shifts carrying the smell of the fields. Or animals. Children slept as they were, their small bodies curled against parents, their hair tangled with straw or lice. The closeness bred warmth, but also filth. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived in the straw, jumping from body to body, their bites leaving red welts that itched through the night. Preparing for sleep was a ritual, small but deliberate. A woman might wipe her face and hands with a damp rag, the water cold from a bucket used all day. She'd comb her hair, loosening knots or picking out lice, her fingers working by firelight. Men did less, maybe a splash of water on their faces, a quick rub of their hands, or a shake of their cloak to knock off dirt. Children were scrubbed by their mother, their faces wiped, their hair combed, though they squirmed and whined. The goal wasn't cleanliness, but comfort, just enough to settle the body for sleep. Some women rubbed herbs, lavender, or mint tint, their hands or shift, hoping the scent would calm the mind or repel bugs. Men might chew a sprig of parsley to freshen breath, a small act before lying down. The hut itself made sleep harder. The single room was smoky, the hearth's embers glowing through the night, leaving a film of soot on skin and bedding. The air was thick with smells, sweat, straw, animals, if they were inside for warmth. In winter, the family huddled close. The straw mattress, damp from snow, tracked in or leaks in the thatched roof. In summer, the hut was stifling, flies buzzing around bedding or chamber pots. Windows, If they existed, were small holes covered with shutters or cloth, letting in drafts but little fresh air. A woman might hang a rag over the window to block the wind, but it did little to clear the stench. Sleep was restless, broken by scratching, coughing, or the creak of the hut in a storm. Vermin were a nightly torment. Bedbugs hid in the straw, biting at night, their marks red and angry by morning. Fleas jumped from bedding to skin, carried by humans or animals. Lice clung to hair, their eggs knotted in braids or beards. A woman might comb her family's hair before bed, crushing lice between her nails, but they always returned. Some sprinkled dried herbs, rosemary, to mint to the mattress, hoping to repel bugs, but it was a weak defense. Shaking out bedding helped, but the dust and bugs scattered into the air, settling back by morning. Children learned to scratch without complaint, their small hands picking at bites or combing their own hair when old enough. The chamber pot was another nighttime challenge. Tucked in a corner, it was used when going outside was too cold or dangerous. The whole family shared it, the smell growing sour as the night wore on. A woman might empty it at dawn, rinsing it with a splash of water, her hands cold and gritty. In winter, the contents froze, making it harder to clean. In summer, flies swarmed, drawn to the odor. Some families kept a pile of straw or ashes near the pot, sprinkling it to dull the smell, but it was never enough. Children were taught to use it carefully, to avoid spills, but accidents happened. The floor damp until morning. Seasons shaped the routine. Winter nights were cold, the family piling blankets or cloaks on the mattress, their breath clouding in the air. Washing before bed was rare, water froze, and firewood was saved for cooking. Summer brought heat, sweat-soaking shifts and bedding, flies buzzing endlessly. Spring's damp made mattresses moldy, the straw rotting unless aired out. Autumn was a rush to prepare for winter, with little time for cleaning, bedding, or combing hair. Women bore the brunt, shaking mattresses, rinsing shifts, or combing children's hair. Their hands never idle. Men helped less, their focus on fields or repairs, but they might carry water or mend a bed frame. Children did small tasks, sweeping straw, carrying rags, learning that sleep, like all else, was work. The church influenced even this. Sleep was a gift from God, but a dirty bed or body could be seen as sloth. Priests urged cleanliness, especially before holy days, when a woman might rinse her shift or scrub her hands to appear pure. Charms were Kamana's sprig of herbs, tucked into bedding, a prayer whispered for protection from spirits or bugs. The church disapproved, but peasants persisted, blending faith with practicality. Neighbors watched too. A family whose bedding smelled too strongly or whose children scratched openly risked gossip, their reputation tarnished. This was the nightly grind, a woman combing lice from her child's hair, a man shaking straw from a cloak, a family curling together on a dusty mattress. Every act was small, repetitive, a fight against the dirt that never left. Clean sleep was a dream. Bearable rest was enough. Let's pause here, in the smoky hut, where a woman tucks a sprig of mint into her shift, her hands rough but steady. The night quiet but never clean. If you'd like to continue, we can explore another corner of peasant life, perhaps their food and cooking, or their tools and crafts. For now, let your eyes droop, let the hum of history fade, and let sleep take over.